investigating journalism. We're not serving the
media bias, I guess, just depends on which channel you watch.
The mainstream media has gone over the top.
Washington is broken.
They can't stand the truth, and apparently the news media can't stand the truth.
Media that affirms their own point of view.
I can't believe anything that they say. I just really can't.
I think that we need a different point of view other than the Republican and the Democratic Party.
There was a Congressional EMP Commission in their final report indicated that an EMP attack on the United States would turn the technology clock back 150 years.
The scud in the tub or the barge off the coast scenario is very real.
They laid out a scenario where a very entry-level weapon in the 20 kiloton range was lobbed at a very high altitude over Cincinnati, Ohio.
The effects could be so widespread that in effect you'd have breakdown of governance.
The worst case scenario is so bad that I think any time I spend on a remedial effort is time taken away from a preventative effort, and this is something that has to be prevented because the country will tear itself apart.
Welcome to For the Record. I'm Lori Dew. Tonight we look at a topic that most other networks won't cover. It's called an electromagnetic pulse, or EMP. News outlets avoid the topic because it often gets labeled a conspiracy theory. But what you'll hear tonight is no theory. An EMP is a massive electromagnetic pulse. It can be released from a nuclear device detonated at a high altitude, destroying electrical grids for hundreds of miles. The aftermath of such an attack could be devastating. Distribution of food and medicine would be nearly impossible. There would be a shortage of clean water, and first responders would be left with no means of communication. Now, this may sound like something out of an apocalyptic thriller, but this is not fiction. This is a critical national security issue that leaders from both parties take seriously because they know that rogue nations and terrorist groups dream of a world without the United States.
A stunning and cowardly strike on the United States.
I think the ruthlessness and horror of 9/11 itself, and the fact that for Al-Qaeda, killing Americans was a huge positive value.
James Woolsey served as the director of the CIA from 1993 to 1995.
These guys lusted after massive destruction, and I think it, to some extent, began people thinking, what if the government in North Korea or in Iran really thought that the world would be so much a better place if they could just kill as many Americans as possible.
After 9/11, Congress ordered a series of studies on weapons of mass destruction. In 2004, the EMP Commission delivered a report on the threat of an electromagnetic pulse attack on the United States.
And the EMP Commission published 5 reports, 3 were classified and 2 were unclassified. The 2 unclassified were in 2004 and 2008. They laid out a scenario where a very entry-level weapon in the 20 kiloton range was lobbed at not a very high altitude over Cincinnati, Ohio.
Michael Del Rosso is an engineer and Pentagon consultant. He has worked with the EMP Commission, and he has participated in confidential congressional briefings on nuclear threats to America.
And the reason they chose that target is because that weapon with the radius of line of sight at the altitude, which was a nominal altitude, would have covered 74.5% of all the electric generating capacity in the United States and 83% of the substations in the United States and the majority of the population.
Bill Graham, who was the chair, the one statement he made that I think needs to be remembered is EMP is one of a small number of effects that has existential consequences that could threaten the existence of the United States.
George Baker is Professor Emeritus of Applied Science at James Madison University. He sits on the Board of Advisors for the Congressional Task Force on National and Homeland Security.
The effects could be so widespread that in effect you'd have breakdown of governance. In Bill Graham's testimony, he thought that upwards of 50% of the population would die within the first year.
For the Record has learned that in 1995, a Russian think tank presented a report to the Russian army recommending the military align with rogue nations, sharing both weapons of mass destruction and missile technology.
There was testimony in 2004 by Soviet flag officers that they rather sheepishly said that technology for super EMP weapons had actually leaked out to North Korea and other rogue nations.
We think enough word of it is leaked out, and it's not a very technically complex idea, that it could well be the case that the North Koreans could pull off something like that.
There's no one that will deny with any credibility that the reason why North Korea and Iran are self-professed emerging nuclear threats to the United States of America is because Russia and China want them to be and have enabled them to be. This is not idle thought. This is what nation states like Iran and North Korea have spent billions of dollars developing this capability. They're doing it for a reason, and they say the reason is the fact that they see the United States as their primary adversary.
In October 2005, then Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad held a conference with other nations hostile to the U.S. and Israel. The meeting was titled "The World Without Zionism."
He very publicly stated that it was not only desirable to have a world without the United States, but it was achievable.
From the podium, Ahmadinejad displayed two large glass spheres, one with the Israeli flag and the other with the American flag, symbolically crashing into the ground.
I think it's indicative of the fact that he thinks that to destroy America first, and surely if you even had one nuclear weapon to use, an EMP attack would give you the most bang for the buck. To neuter the United States opens the path to his aspirations of destroying Israel and killing every Jew in the face of the world, which are stated aspirations.
I would think, given the degree of hatred that both Iran and North Korea have for us, and given the state of their technologies, that it's a virtual certainty that they're working hard on being able to figure out how to test the components of the system for EMP without testing an all-up system.
Russia and China, with their nuclear arsenals and ICBMs, certainly they've been able to do it for decades. But the emerging, we call them nuclear wannabes, North Korea and Iran, they are including EMP-type attacks in their planning scenarios and their planning exercises.
The technology is in the hands of not only sometimes aggressive and domineering superpowers like China and Russia, but also in the hands of the likes of Kim Jong-un, and that's a toss of the coin on whether or not somebody like that under pressure would try something like this.
Iran is currently engaged in nuclear talks with the United States and 5 other nuclear powers. Iranian leaders have requested that economic sanctions be lifted against their country in exchange for accepting uranium production limits and international inspections. Our story continues when we return.
We needed 30.
July 9th, 1962. The United States conducted a high-altitude nuclear test over the Pacific Ocean. It was called the Starfish Prime Test, and the electrical pulse from the blast was felt 900 miles away in the Hawaiian Islands. The data collected from that event showed the U.S. military the potential damage an EMP can cause, information they have had for more than 50 years.
We have a great deal of modeling, but you don't just have the opportunity to test the aftermath of a nuclear warhead at altitude every day. But we do have all the way back to Bikini Island and the Starfish Prime tests and things of that nature.
We noticed that some of the electrical systems and radio systems in Hawaii failed, and that's where people started to realized that there was something electromagnetic happening.
After the Starfish Prime test, the U.S. government immediately took steps to protect military assets.
The Department of Defense, as they built out the Minuteman system, the ground system and the missiles, included EMP protection in the Minuteman system. It's been 50 years ago.
So we've hardened that capability tremendously, again, at the cost of hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. But our civilian grid, upon which 99% of the military's electricity in CONUS is dependent upon, it's essentially unprotected.
I think that's largely right. I think the only civilian systems that were hardened were the president's airplane and maybe some of his command and control, assuming you want to consider that civilian. But no one was thinking of protecting the civilian infrastructure.
And that is the great conundrum here for me, is that one of two things is true. Either the military has this wrong, and this is no problem, and therefore we should stop spending all the money to harden against it. Or if it is a problem, then we should harden the grid upon which the military depends for 99% of its electricity needs in this continent.
A Pentagon study made available to For the Record revealed the crippling impact of an EMP strike on the eastern seaboard. The report was based on a simulation where a Scud-type missile was launched from 200 miles off the coast. In this scenario, the nation would lose nearly $800 billion in infrastructure assets, especially large-scale components necessary to maintain the electrical grids.
The problem is that the EMP can damage these heavy-duty components in the transmission and distribution lines. These components are so big, and many of them are not manufactured in the United States anymore.
We especially don't manufacture the large, extremely high-voltage transformers. Those are done in Germany and South Korea, I think. If those are knocked out, you're talking a year or two probably to replace them if you're lucky. You're talking about trying to harvest with plow horses.
These transformers are 2 stories high. They operate at hundreds of thousands of volts. Now there is an effort to recapitalize some of the old manufacturing plants. So hopefully that will be rectified. But right now we have to import them from places like Japan and Germany.
Baker says protecting the nation's power grid is critical and should be the first priority.
You know, you've got 16 infrastructures out there. DHS has a list of 16. The most critical of the 16 is the electric power grid. That is the most vulnerable. If you've got electricity and other things go out, at least you got lights on so you can see to fix the other things, the other 15 things.
Perhaps the most disturbing information uncovered in this story comes from military intelligence, which has collected evidence of mock EMP tests by rogue nations.
When you have Iran doing practice runs, as it were, who are launching missiles from water-launched platforms or water-launched capabilities, a better way to put it, and detonating the dummy warhead at apogee, I don't know what other military scenario to ascribe that to.
They put satellites in orbit. Their space launch vehicle is really a ballistic missile that can carry weaponized payloads. And on a couple of occasions, they've launched Shahed missiles from barges in the Caspian Sea and detonated them at apogee, which is exactly the profile that would happen if you were to launch a ship-borne EMP attack against the United States of America.
In September 2012, the Iranian Navy announced plans to start missions in the Atlantic Ocean and Gulf of Mexico, technically in international waters, but just off the U.S. coast. That directive came after the Revolutionary Guard test-launched a ballistic missile at sea.
I will just tell you that the scud in the tub or the barge off the coast scenario is very real, and the challenge is, you know, I chair the Missile Defense Caucus here in the Congress, and I'm very aware of what our missile defense capability is. And that kind of scenario presents the greatest challenge to our missile defense system, simply because it doesn't give us time to react.
You could actually easily on a barge or a freighter in a container-sized enclosure have an erector launcher to launch a Scud or a Shahed missile, and from the Gulf of Mexico, radar wouldn't even see it, and detonated over the continental United States.
Shared space technology from China and Russia has expanded missile delivery options for rogue nations. In December 2012, North Korea launched the satellite KMS-3-2, which military experts say followed an offensive strike course over the United States.
So in April, at the time of heightened tension over North Korea's nuclear program. There was literally a satellite hovering over the Midwest and the eastern portion of the United States in multiple orbital paths during that entire month. We did nothing about it. As a matter of fact, it was not even in the popular press that this was a threat, that this was a tactic that the Soviets had developed, and that you could be looking at the exercise of that tactic right now in a scenario that might lead to something more sinister in the future.
For the Record spoke to multiple Pentagon officials who confirmed both North Korea and Iran are close to developing nuclear-capable intercontinental ballistic missiles and satellite delivery systems.
Well, you might be getting into a classified area. I will just say this, that some of the things that are in the public domain, as you know, that there have been, in both countries, light satellite technology launched.
A key factor in protecting the continental United States is effectiveness of the nation's early warning systems.
We have a series of radars, but these radars are Cold War systems, and they're looking for weapons coming over the North Pole from Russia.
Well, if you launch a ballistic missile from land, it's traceable. But this doesn't require any kind of accuracy or a particularly heavy throw weight if you launch it from a vessel. And the sad truth is that not only do we not have a national missile defense, we just have 2-point anti-ballistic missile systems, one in Vandenberg and one in Fort Greely in Alaska, but we don't even have radar that looks south.
The evidence is compelling. America's enemies are making great strides in their ability to launch an EMP attack. Yet there seems to be a disconnect between the military and congressional leaders as to the severity and scope of the threat.
I think it's like everything else. It takes a while for the reality to sort of permeate into the consciousness of lawmakers. You know, there are so many different things that we have to deal with. And when you have nuclear Iran and terrorism across the world, sometimes it's difficult to say, well, we have a new and very significant threat.
It needs to be planned systematically and wisely. But this country has done so many more technologically complex and difficult things than protecting the electric grid from EMP and even EMP and hacking, that it's amazing.
I have frequent contact with members of the House and the Senate, with staffers, with people in national security and national security policy, both uniformed and staff. And depending on these topics, there's a surprising ignorance. It's hard to have an intelligent conversation with many of them.
We end our story this evening with some information you should know regarding EMP legislation that is now before Congress.
There's several people and members in Congress on both sides of the spectrum that are very concerned about this. The two leading the pact are Representative Trent Franks from Arizona, a conservative Republican, and Representative Yvette Clarke from Brooklyn, a progressive Democrat.
On June 18, 2013, H.R. 2417, known as the SHIELD Act, was introduced to Congress.
If you look at a worst case scenario, which is a long shot, but nevertheless that's the job of some of us in these positions to do. And if there's anything that motivates me in this entire effort, it is that scenario, because I'm convinced that over the years, across history, each time a major vulnerability existed, an enemy almost always tried to exploit it, and the EMP is the ultimate asymmetric weapon.
The SHIELD Act would push the federal government to install grid-saving devices and surge protectors that could save giant transformers and power systems from an EMP. The bill's co-sponsor believes time is running out as a nuclear Iran becomes a major threat.
I am convinced with all of my heart that if Iran gains nuclear weapons, that this world will step into the shadow of nuclear terrorism, and that EMP will be a vital threat to this country and to other civilizations. And it's our job as people that have the privilege and the profound responsibility of being guardians of humanity to intervene if we can.
Experts say, based on the cost estimates, the bill is both a reasonable and responsible piece of legislation.
EMP is not terribly difficult to defend against. You're talking probably a few dollars a person.
What that bill does is it empowers FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, to require the electric industry to protect our grid. It's ironic that the most critical infrastructure, the electric grid, is also the most vulnerable to this effect.
On June 21st, the bill was referred to the Subcommittee on Energy and Power. As of the air date of this story, the bill remains in committee. Meanwhile, there is no federal agency that has a direct responsibility to protect the United States electrical infrastructure.
Nobody's in charge of the electric grid. You think Department of Energy? No. Department of Energy basically works on nuclear waste and funds nuclear laboratories. There's a small office that deals with electric grids, but nobody that has any real power. This is something that is not being dealt with. It is improvements in it are fought by industry, and it's extremely frustrating because it's very dangerous to let this grid sit there the way it is while the Russians and Chinese have fully and completely protected theirs.
Yeah.
Yes.
They're ready for one.
Yes.
What does that tell you?
Well, it tells you that on this issue, the Russians and Chinese are more responsible than we are.
In 2004, the Congressional EMP Commission estimated that it would take a one-time investment of $2 billion to harden the entire U.S. electrical grid against an EMP. Today, that estimate has actually been reduced to $500 million. That's less than 1% of what the Government Accountability Office reported was wasted in 2012. And that's our show for this evening. Thank you for joining us on For the Record. We'll see you next time.